Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of MPA's Connecting with Nature series. Look, it's a real joy to introduce tonight's webinar because it's a piece of work that we're doing which is addressing one of the absolute long-standing sort of conservation challenges in New South Wales, which is those huge gaps in the map in Western New South Wales from a reserve establishment perspective. But I just need to start by acknowledging that we're all variously meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who haven't used the webinar sort of features in Zoom previously, you can't ask questions, you can't vocally ask questions as we sort of go through, but what you can do is if you go and just sort of hover your cursor over the bottom bar of the computer, you'll see two things. One is on the left-hand side is a thing called chat, and you're very welcome to use that to sort of make comment during the discussion. But if you want to actually ask a question that Ross and Steph can answer at the end of the webinar, just use the Q&A and I'll make sure that we capture those at the end and that any questions you have get sort of answered. So as I say, this is a really exciting evening because this isn't about MPA inviting someone else to come in and tell them about their fantastic work. What this is two of our stalwarts of MPA telling us a project that we are kicking off and has now got to the point where it's got enough momentum and enough shape that we're in a position to share with people what it is we're trying to do, which really is to think about what's the next generation of protected areas across the western part of the state, which as many people know is hugely underrepresented at a bioregional level in terms of protected areas. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Ross McDonnell and Steph Carter, and I think Ross is going to start proceedings. Yeah, I'm just really looking forward to it. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Gary. We'll just wait for the presentation to start. Okay, as Gary mentioned, this webinar tonight is about the so-called Western New South Wales project under NPA. So it's Steph Clark and myself are the two presenters today. Yeah, we're sharing a screen, so I'll have to say next when we're moving on next. Next, Steph. So look, as with Gary, there was an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners, past, present and emerging, and recognise that wherever we are in Australia, we're on Aboriginal land. Next, Steph. So just as an overview, there's about 27 slides. Not about, there is 27 slides. And so it's really in two parts. We'll be talking about the objectives and the context of the project, about how we're preparing to progress with it based on the bioregional and sub-bioregional reviews. Then the second part of the presentation is really about the methodology we'll use and the timeline and current status. So in terms of the objectives, there's a few. The first one is to allow NPA to develop a strategy to identify conservation priorities in Western New South Wales. That's the primary aim of it. It's also going to provide direction for NPA advocacy, which is one of NPA's primary roles. It'll also provide an opportunity for NPA to develop a GIS capability, that's Geographic Information System capability, which NPA has not had until this point. And GIS is critical for the project itself. We'd also use this project to establish and or reinforce links with regional conservation stakeholders. And the scope of the project is to cover the central and western divisions of New South Wales. So this shows you a map of those defined regions, the West Land Division and the Central Land Division. So they constitute about 70% of the state, west of the Great Divide, but the project won't be sticking to those lines. It'll be more around the bioregional lines, but that's sort of roughly where the project's focusing on. In terms of the history of the project, its genesis started a couple of years ago amongst a few members of the NPA executive. and it relates to an item in the current NPA strategy, 2018 to 2022. And the item is to implement a protected area plan in Western New South Wales. So this project is aimed at that item. There was a 12-month period where the NPA's Landscape Conservation Forum looked at different proposals of a project. And finally, one was endorsed, was sent, and was also equally considered by the NPA executive, and then subsequently endorsed by State Council in September 2021. There is a project control group that's been established. It hasn't had a lot to do to date because the project hasn't really been at a critical mass to warrant it, but the group will come into play as we move forward, and its role will be to provide direction and governance around the project. And a project office has been recruited, which is the co-host tonight, Steph. You right, Steph? Next one.
Oh, yeah, it should be on. Yeah.
Right, sorry. So in terms of NPA's previous works in Western New South Wales, there's a few that stand out. There's a report in 1992 by Morgan and Terry, which had a detailed listing of the vegetation communities in the West, as well as some very useful maps about where those vegetation communities occurred. There was a program run in NPA called West Program, ran from 2008 to 2013. It had a number of different elements to it, but one of the standout elements was strong advocacy for the protection of River Red Gum in New South Wales, and that resulted in legislation in 2010, which saw an expansion of the national park system in southwest New South Wales. It included 99 state forests. Another piece of work that NPA has been involved with, Bev Smiles led a group of people in June 2021. A report was produced which relates to travelling stock routes, linear reserves across Western New South Wales, which we'll focus on in a little while.
So I'll go from here, Ross, if that's okay. So just as some context of where that places us and places the project now. Western and Central New South Wales is underrepresented in New South Wales Protected Area Network compared to the coast and the mountains. The evolving 30 by 30 initiative provides a challenge for underrepresented bioregions in New South Wales. The National State of the Environment report had a really stark review of the state of the environment currently. And we've also got the context of what the information that the bioregional surveys that were completed in the 90s and 2000s provide us. We'll go into that, all of these more in depth over the next few slides. So, as I'm sure you're all aware from what we've said previously in the past couple of slides, there's been a lot of work done in this space by NPA for years. But just to place where we're at and where the work that we're doing is currently in a global and national space, I'll go more into depth about what 30 by 30 told us and what the State of the Environment report told us. So just for all of you who might not be completely clear about 30 by 30 and what it is, what its goals were, and who was a part of it. 30 by 30 is a global initiative. It's basically a coalition of member parties, which are countries across the world. There's nearly 100 members, signed members, and basically together, the coalition is called the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. So basically, the overarching aim of that coalition is to reach a goal of at least 30% of the world's land and at least 30% of the oceans to be conserved or protected by 2030. So not only will those goals be reached at an international scale, signing members also agree that those goals should be reached at a national scale as well. And that's, yeah, look, there's loads and loads of reports by scientists basically saying that reaching that goal is really important to maintain ecosystem function, good biodiversity, buffers from climate change, all of that. So yeah, Australia has been a signing member. Well, Australia joined in 2021 at the G7 summit. So that's at the international scale. Then at the national scale, we've had the State of the Environment report. And that was basically a comprehensive assessment of the health of Australia's environment. And that was written by independent experts. The results were pretty dire. What it said was pretty dire, as I'm sure that you've all heard. Basically, our environment is under extreme pressure. And just picking out the parts of the report that relate directly to the project, the Western Project currently. The project really has a focus on protected areas and lands being a part of the protected area network. And the State of the Environment report itself said that protected areas are widely considered to be the best way to protect biodiversity, maintain diversity and quality of ecosystems, improve their capacity to adapt to change, and provide the needs of future generations. So within the State of the Environment report, there are a couple of figures in there. And the report itself said that Australia did not meet ecologically representative protected area targets. The targets in that report were at least 10% of each ecoregion within the country. And so those targets were lower than the international 30%. So just to have a couple of different numbers in the air. Okay. What about New South Wales? Russ.
Well, this slide shows you the status of bioregions. So there have been quite a number of bioregional surveys undertaken in New South Wales during the 1990s and 2000s. One way of reviewing the level of protection across New South Wales is to focus on how it happens in each of the bioregions. So this map here shows you the recognised bioregions in New South Wales, and it identifies the status of protected areas. So the dark green indicates that over 15% of the lands in those bioregions are protected. The light green, as you can see in the legend, 10 to 15%. But this project is focusing on the parts that are running down through the middle, which are the bioregions where it's less than 10%. In many cases, it's less than 2%, and in some cases, it's way less than 2.5%. So that's what's driving the project. That's part of the context and background. This one represents the same level of detail in a slightly different way. It shows the bioregions in different colours, but overlaying on the top of that is the current National Park Reserve System. The circles show where some recent additions to the reserve system have occurred, but you can see quite clearly that there's a large body of reserves along the coast of the mountains and up in the far northwest corner. It's just some recent data received from NPWS it relates to how each of the bioregions are protected under the NPWS reserve system. So here is a table showing each of the bioregions down on the left-hand column. The columns in the middle show how much of each bioregion is either inside the National Park estate or outside, what the grand total of each bioregion is in hectares, I should have said. And the very right-hand column shows the level of protection in each of the bioregions. Now, what I've done here is to highlight a number of standout ones. So you've got the Australian Alps up in the top right-hand corner with 81% of that bioregion protected in Kosciuszko National Park, for example. Down the bottom, you've also got a couple of blue items, which are the Sydney Basin's over 40% protected, and the southeast corner. This project's going to focus on some of the bioregions in the middle, which, and I've highlighted in pink, that you've got, so the Cobar Penny Plain, the Darling Riverina Plains, and in particular the Southwest Slopes, which are just, all three of them are under 3%, but there's quite a number of them there that are under 10%. What we're hoping to do with this project is not just to drill down into the bioregions, but to go further down into the sub-bioregions. Again, these are defined, described areas within bioregions. And again, this information came very recently from NPWS, and it shows the differences that occur within bioregions. So here's two of the bioregions that were in the previous slide. the column on the left-hand side, Broken Hill and the Channel Country. Then the next column shows the sub-regions. And again, as you go across the columns, you've got the amount of area protected under NPWS reserves, areas outside, the grand total. Then you've got the bioregional total, but you can see in the last column on the right that there's quite a difference in the sub-regions in each bioregion. If you look at the Channel Country, there are a couple of blue sub-regions which are over 20%, but you've also got some which are, well, there's one there that's on 0. So there's quite a bit of work to do when you think about bioregions that are underrepresented if you drill them down into the sub-regions. So this project is aiming to look for conservation priorities specifically in those underrepresented bioregions and sub-bioregions. The project's not just going to look at identifying conservation priorities which could be converted into national park estate. We're looking at a mixed model approach. So we're not necessarily looking for lands that could be national parks in the future. So we'll be, in terms of trying to identify where those conservation priorities are and recognise what their current management status is, you know, we'll be looking at the gazetted reserves, where the state forests are, look at other forms of Crown land, an example being the travelling stock routes, of which there are 6,500 in New South Wales, covering almost 2 million hectares, so it's a large parcel of land. Obviously, they're linear in shape, but they do constitute a large body, and there are conservation values that occur within them, as one of the reports that MPA has been involved with in the past identified. And 75% of those travelling stock routes are in the Western Division. There are what you might call third-party interests as well. So, you know, examples being the Nature Conservancy and the Bush Heritage Trust. They've, you know, private entities that have bought land, hold it privately, but they manage them for conservation. So they'll be part of our reckoning in terms of where priorities in the future should be. And then obviously there are private land holdings. There is a lot of well-protected, biodiverse, rich portions of private land holdings across the state, and we'll be aiming to look to see where those values are on those lands. Here's a slide which shows graphically the extent of travelling stock reserves across New South Wales, particularly Western New South Wales. So you can see that there's a grid, a network of these linear reserves, often with some well-recognised biodiversity values. This is an example of Bush Heritage's work across Australia. So these are ecosystems which Bush Heritage have acquired properties within, and while the maps of Australia, you can see that there are various properties across New South Wales. Another example is of Nature Conservancy, and this slide shows where you can have a dovetailing of conservation management in particular areas when you combine the gazetted reserve system with Nature Conservancy work. So this map shows you the western portions of the Murrumbidgee River. The dark green is the Yanga National Park, which has 110 kilometres of river frontage along the Murrumbidgee River. But adjoining it to the east is the former Nimikaira or Gaini, which is a Nature Conservancy parcel of land. It's in the Low Bidgee, and it's managed by the Nari tribal body. To the north of there, the Great Kumbung, that's the terminal end of the Lachlan River before it joins into the Murrumbidgee, which it does under flood. But you can see that there are 3 parcels of land there that are in that part of the world, all managed for nature conservation. And just out of interest, up in the top right-hand corner is the Calliere National Park. So it's just not all about national park activity.
Thanks, Russ. So I'll take over from here. So with all of this, you know, all of this information, all of this stuff that's happening in New South Wales currently, I'll take us to the project methodology. So basing where we're at into physically the practice that we're taking for the project. So there's a few goals for the project, one of which is developing an internal GIS capability for NPA, and that will be happening adjacent to the project. So while we're working on, like, the Western project itself and doing that mapping for the central and western areas, it will also just generally be upping our skills. We're also we'll also be undertaking a literature review and gaining access to available data layers. And so a lot of those data layers are actually the information that we've mentioned in the previous slides. So, stuff like the protection status of different land parcels, and how they're basically if where state forest is, where national parks is, how that all interlocks, and looking at it at like a network wide level. We'll also be reviewing the previous bioregional surveys and reviewing the previous survey outcomes against subsequent actions and looking at gap analysis. So potentially there are areas where bioregional surveys weren't conducted. So potentially we could be looking at those areas and, trying to fill in the information there, or looking into the future and seeing if, say, if areas have been protected, if there's anywhere that needs to be prioritized. Another step of the methodology would be ground truthing potential areas for protection measures, reviewing protection measure options. So talking back to that, potentially, different conservation statuses. Using the CAR approach, so making sure that the areas that we identify would mean that the protected area network is comprehensive, adequate, and representative. And then we also have a few different options that we could go as the next step. So basically, we've been talking about percent protected of different bioregions, but we live in the real world. We live in a world that is bounded by many factors, people, society, money. If we have to make decisions around what is prioritized when, then we potentially could look into basically some decision support. So basically being like, what should be prioritized? What lands are irreplaceable? What, if lost, would have a hugely negative effect? What lands are highly valuable? Because so you'd weight all those different decisions to try and come up to basically being able to tier priority of lands. So going back to the review of previous bioregional surveys, so that's placing the project in the research that already exists. So surveys were completed in various New South Wales bioregions in the 90s and early 2000s. So basically some of the surveys compared vegetation using pre-European and current layers to determine their status. And also some of the surveys determined conservation priority locations based on vegetation status. So looking at bioregional surveys is part of the methodology and placing us where we are, but also the bioregional surveys exist as data layers. So using GIS, we can use it as an information layer to be able to help us with making decisions and determining what we prioritize.
So I'll now talk to a couple of slides that relate to one of the bioregional surveys that have been completed. This one's the Riverina. This area is about the size of Tasmania in southwestern New South Wales. So the maps here show the New South Wales portion of the bioregion, Riverina bioregion. When that survey was undertaken, there was no vegetation layers available, so they had to be created. And an expert panel was used to assist with that. So to develop a status of vegetation communities, as Steph mentioned, a pre-European layer was created, which is the one on the left. So it was generated by interrogating files held by the Lands Department, various other government agencies, local government bodies, but also involved the expert panel drawing lines on maps based on their understanding of the geology and the ecology. And to a certain extent, the current vegetation map, or the extent vegetation map shown on the right, was a similar process. Portions of the river in a bioregion had a current vegetation map, but some of it also required an expert panel to extrapolate. So that process had had a series of vegetation communities. There was about 20 odd that were identified and recognised, and the reason for doing that was so that you could compare apples with apples. The next slide shows a summary of that outcome. So those 20 odd vegetation communities are listed down the left-hand side. The then current vegetation in the next column, the pre-European level, these are all in hectares. The next level, and that allowed for the status of each of the vegetation communities to be identified, which translated into where the conservation intent would be down the track. So what I've done there is to highlight that there were a number of vegetation communities which could be shown, if you accepted the methodology, to have less than 10% of their previous extent remaining in the early 2000s. And the numbers change from there as you go down the screen. As Steph mentioned, one option for this project is to not just to undertake a review based purely on GIS capability and analysis based around GIS, but to employ a decision support system. And these get used in many different ways in modern society. But for the purposes here, it was helped to make decisions when you had large databases. And so a DSS functions where you load in data layers and then you pose questions. And the question might be, for example, if you wanted to protect 30% of a vegetation type, where might they be? If you wanted to protect them and you wanted them to be greater than 30 hectares in size, and you wanted them to be in some form of linear corridor, or within 100 kilometres of some other, these are just examples of the questions you would pose in a DSS, and then you allow it to produce a series of images. In this case, there are two images. One is a conservation map, which is on the left-hand side. So that's basically all the assembled information and identifying different priority levels to where conservation effort in the future could occur. The one on the right is, as Steph mentioned, is a map of showing site irreplaceability. So in the context here is that irreplaceability is a term used to say that a portion of land with attributes is totally irreplaceable if you are seeking to reach an objective. In this case, the objective was that 10% of the pre-existing, pre-European vegetation needs to be protected and conserved. So the red areas were areas where, to reach that objective, the vegetation on those lands are irreplaceable. You can't trade them off. You can't do any biobanking with them. That's where the conservation effort needs to be if you want to meet your objective. Now, this sort of brings into play a question around the 30 by 30 initiative and whether or not 30% of the natural values is 30% of what remains now or 30% of what occurred at some time in the past. And so there's different ways you can do the analysis, whether you do what exists now compared to a geographical area, such as those tables that were shown earlier, or whether it's represented as 30% of the pre-European level or extent of vegetation, as this map shows.
Thanks, Russ. So what are the next steps and where are we placed in the project currently? So As Ross talked to, there's different analysis that we can do, and kind of going back to talking about this map here and the combined priority maps and site irreplaceability. Basically, like data can tell us many things, and we can make it say many stories, and deciding how we present the data nutting out our methodology. So going back to the 30 by 30, so percent of area protected, a really simple way of showing that using the images that we've seen in the past few slides is the first image with the clear map of New South Wales, of the bioregions. So thinking about it in how that would be presented in GIS. So basically, GIS is mapping software. We can have a whole lot of different layers of different data and stuff like that, and it shows in like a image. You can analyze it, lots of numbers. Basically, we would load the bioregions, which is in the first image, and then we'd also have the layer of the different areas of and their conservation status. So whether they're, you know, national parks, state forests, third-party protected areas. And then we'd arrive at a final score, which would be percent of the area that's protected in that network and what isn't. So we can just look at, you know, for example, compared to all of New South Wales, and then the percent of those bioregional areas that are within that network in the second picture. So that in itself is telling a really powerful story. And then we can also take it to the next step of going into that site irreplaceability. So that's where we've got a whole lot of other different factors that we need to weigh. And so even just scoring what makes something a site that has site irreplaceability, you know, has so many different, it can be presented in so many different ways. So another thing as well is what site needs to be protected urgently. And what's more time tight. So that's that in that second analysis part, that's a really crunchy and good stuff. So these are the two potential steps, and we're aiming to do the first and then continue into the second. So what's the timeline of the project so far? So we had endorsement from State Council, September 2021. Project control group was formed early 2022. Project officer coming on board April 2022. And now we're arriving at the part where we are currently. So we're really in the scheme of things for this current iteration of the Western project quite early on. We're around that stage. And next up, we've got some project funding applications that will be, submitting. So mid 2022. We will be, the GIS capability will be developed late 2022. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next few slides because it's really exciting. Data layers gained and analysed early 2023. So that was going back to, you know, the data layers that we've seen previously in this presentation. We'll be doing stakeholder consultations mid 2023, targeted ground truthing late next year, and then reports and advocacy from 2024. So multi-year project. So what are some of the deliverables of the project? So basically when I was talking about increasing the GIS capability, as just before, in amongst mapping at a state level, so the central and western areas, along the way, as we're increasing the GIS capabilities of MPA, we can also, be involved and, use GIS for more locally based works. So here's a map. Here's an example from, there's basically an application that's happening currently in the Jervis Bay area. And so basically it's a proposal of what should be added to the protected areas there. So I'll just run you through what this shows. And so I've been making this map over the past few weeks. And really excitingly, we got to, I got to be physically in Jervis Bay and be shown all of the areas by Warwick and everyone who was there. So the darker green area where it says on the right hand side, Jervis Bay National Park. So that's land that's in the current national park. Down to the left as well, Palmer Creek Nature Reserve NR on the left hand side. So all the dark green areas are NPWS reserve land. The lighter green that is still the full colour is state forest. And then anywhere that we have that lime green where it says Kalala Bay, that is biobanked area, so it's the Halloran lands. So, and then anywhere that's got that that diagonal hash is area that we think should be added to the protected area lands there. And basically, it's been ground truth checked, and we believe that it would make really great additions to that area. So this is a really cool case study example, and it was also used as like a kind of nutting out the processes so that we can scale it up for the rest of the Western project. But this is an example of some of the deliverables that we'll be able to provide along the way. Also, it'd be really exciting if other MPA members would be able to do content like this as well. So that's another goal. So potentially I could run, quick DIY how-tos on this kind of stuff, so that local groups can, and local branches can have this capability within their branches. So here's an example of one of the deliverables. It will be used for a formal proposal. Isn't that really cool?
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Ross. And look, thanks so much to both of you for walking us through what, as I've said, is an incredibly exciting sort of project and unbelievably timely in terms of the international focus on protecting areas as being part of the solution to the various crises that we face at the moment. I'm, as always, take the chair's discretion to ask the first couple of questions, and I'm going to ask one to each of you, and starting with Steph. Steph, when you talked about the data that's available, I mean, I guess the thing that perhaps not everybody realizes is how extraordinary it is that we're now at a situation where, as an independent conservation organization, an entirely independent organization, we're able to access an extraordinary detail and scale of so that's fantastic to know that can then support the sort of sophisticated analysis you're talking about. One of the things I guess that I'm mindful of is that there's been a lot of discussion of the extraordinary increase in land clearance across New South Wales since the Biodiversity Conservation Act came into effect in 2016 and really profoundly changed the rule set that applied to land clearing. Can we be confident that in fact that we can get data that is contemporary enough so that it's giving us a snapshot of the landscape reasonably close to what it is now, rather than what it was 10 years ago when some of the data sets were put together?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Just to go to the first bit of what you were saying first, because I think it's really a really important thing to, and really cool thing to kind of direct ourselves to. The fact that we have access to these data sets in the first place is very useful, very important to be able to make informed decisions around what areas we'll conserve. Imagine trying to make a decision taking the context away from the environment and going to something like say health or doctor or medicine, whatever. Like imagine if you were, you know, trying to make sure that your patient could be as healthy as they could be, and, you know, that you're giving them the right kind of medical care that they needed, but you didn't actually have any of their stats, you know, at a kind of like body-wide scale. If you don't have the information and the data, or if you don't have enough, or if you don't have like a comprehensive data to be able to make informed decisions, it's really hard to make sure that they have the best form of care that they can receive. So the fact like that an organization like MPA can easily access that data now, which is quite new. In the past, people have had to make you know, applications for it, and so it can take a lot of time to be able to. It took a lot of time to be able to get access to those data sets that were held by different bodies. The fact that we can have access to that is incredible. It's really exciting. So thanks for mentioning that bit. The second bit about land clearing, and example of land clearing and making sure that the data that we access is up to date and current. A really great thing about the data sets is that they are dated, and so you can get information on them to basically within the data set, within all that info, it has information about how current they are. If the data set's been superseded, it then directs you to more up-to-date information, and it is dated. So some of those data sets are being updated, you know, and posted to the data portal seed, you know, every couple of days and stuff. But it looks like they are on generally at a 3, 4, 5 year cycle or so. But that is something that is, yeah, looking at the specifics and the time kind of portions between each, you know, packet of information of that data is something that I look forward to finding out and verifying.
Thanks, Steph. And now my question to Ross. Ross, you know, we've both been with previous hats involved in establishing new reserves. In a coastal setting that I'm sort of more used to, that's often really just about taking control of the fences and the roads and thinking about where you put some visitor facilities. That's far from the case in the West, though, where, you know, land has a much more complex history in terms of the way water's been managed and, frankly, the intensity of pest and weeds that you're dealing with. Without jumping, you know, all the way to the end of this project, could you just give us a little bit of insight into what's typically involved in transitioning lands from current broad mixed uses to a conservation focus when it comes to Western New South Wales?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think one of the key points you mentioned is that the lands that are being acquired as reserves, in whatever form they take, are lands that have had a history of use. Grazing is one good one. In some locations, you've got a history of irrigated cropping. You've got the history of rabbits, for example, and currently with goats quite extensively across Western New South Wales. So they all exert not just a current impact, but an impact that is over decades. And so part of the trick in trying to identify areas to be gazetted as new reserves has been to look at the potential of lands, not just the existing values, but what is the potential if the right mix of conservation measures were applied. So you're getting into the realm of conservation ecology, which is a specific science, a specific discipline, and should be treated quite seriously in its application. So in terms of where to go to in the West, if we want to be serious as a community about having a representative, comprehensive and adequate system, and that the values are properly protected, there is a need not just to take on a parcel of land now and consider that its protection is purely around conserving what is there now, because in many locations in the West, it's a degraded ecosystem, as the State of the Environment report shows, but it's not a lost cause. You can bring areas back, you know, the Nature Conservancy and bodies like that, you know, look at pest control, keeping pests out and reintroducing native animals back into the landscape. Those are the sort of things that should be encouraged into the future.
Thanks, Russ. I'm now going to go to questions from our various attendees or participants at the webinar. Might start with the most generic one, in fact, which is from David, and asking whether there's restrictions placed on how MPA can use or publicise the data sets that we're accessing.
I would answer that by saying yes, definitely. To be honest with you, I was a little nervous about what we might have been presenting tonight. And I think into the future, we need to have some policies which the governance, the control group could help establish about what we do with the data that we generate ourselves. We may well need to sign confidentiality agreements in terms of getting access to data layers that other parties hold now, that we get access to, and how we use that and what we produce from that information. So there's a few items like that we definitely do need to address.
Thanks. And it leads me to a question from Bernadette, which is specifically focusing in on, I guess, the reservation status around Bathurst LGA. But I guess the broader question that sits with it, is there any reason that we couldn't put the percentages, reservation percentages, as they currently sit per bioregion on the MPA website?
Look, I wouldn't think that there would be a problem with that. It's as long as it's not particularly site specific. This is where the concern lies around confidentiality, is that you could be identifying, and we will be, in terms of an outcome of this project, identifying private lands, and obviously the private landholders may well be concerned about that occurring. So, you know, there's a fine line between providing guidance and direction around how the community should move forward, particularly when you're looking at private lands. You know, it's very useful to provide some guidance and direction, but you need to be cognizant of the confidentiality issues.
Sure. So I guess I mean, just to let everybody know, the sensitivity is always going to be around, you know, a relatively powerful voice like MPA sort of saying this is a piece of land that should be preserved, that should be protected, and that, you know, in some cases could well be lands that private lands or lands over which people have title. That's still a separate issue from what's already out there in terms of, you know, the existing protected area network, which I think is a very reasonable thing for us to be able to provide people an easy link to that, and to put that into a bioregional context of, you know, what's the current state of play. And I think that one of the exciting things that comes out of this project is that, you know, it's basically telling us that this is some of the basic information that members and supporters would like to be able to see, because it's such a different picture across the state. Question from Valerie, which is, could you sort of run through as an example how you'd work out how much of the ironbark community that runs down on the inland side of the Great Divide, she's used the example, e.g. near the area near Temora, needs to be conserved, and, you know, where it might be located?
Ross, would you want to?
Okay, so look, it's another good example of how powerful the tools we have now available to us. So, you know, we can use vegetation layers that, as Steph said, can be dated. We can look at, you know, how much of the ironbark existed at previous times. We can look at how much ironbark there is now. The mapping data that exists can identify where in the landscape that vegetation community is now, and potentially where it was in the past. And therefore you can then identify where the conservation priority should be into the future if you want to protect a certain amount of the ironbark community. It's a pretty standard, straightforward process. It's just you really need to have the data layers, and you need to have an intent on how you're going to use them to deliver an outcome.
Yeah.
And-
Could I, sorry, Steph, could I just ask you to go back to the slide you had, which was actually showing those bioregions, just so we can.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was quite early on. And just while I'm going back to the, I'll just quickly say that, yeah, as part of the project, it would be good to kind of have like a really clear process, you know, this is how you would do this. And there's sometimes no better teacher than someone who has recently learned. So that is kind of, yeah, going to be one of my, yeah, part of my role,
that's
which is
that's
really
the
exciting.
one.
This one, Gary? Yeah.
Look, that brings us to the end of the sort of questions I had. I guess I just wanted to finish by sort of asking everybody to have another quick look at that image. And, you know, I've got to say, I personally, I'm someone who I thought I had a pretty good overview of the situation across New South Wales, and it's always really good and telling when you're actually confronted by data that tells you that you're not half as clever or knowledgeable as you thought you were. And I got to say, it makes absolute sense that the Southwest Slopes are in the current situation. But I certainly didn't have it in my head that in fact the northwest corner's not too bad at the moment. The coast is certainly good, but in fact, you know, some of the poorest reserved landscapes are actually in the middle of New South Wales, not way out on the sort of western rim. And I think it's a really good indication of how important it is to be a data-driven organisation, to actually start from the reality of what's going on in the paddock rather than the rhetoric and the sort of the narrative. And, you know, we need to base our conservation advocacy on good science, on good analysis. And it's just a delight that this project is setting us up so strongly to be able to pursue that sort of objective rigor in the way that we advocate for, you know, a better outcome for what's really, I can't even say 2/3 of the state, you know, more like 3/4 to, you know, 4/5 of the state. So look, on that note, I just want to thank you both very much for what you presented tonight, and really appreciate the, you know, the professionalism with which this project is running out, and hope that we can get an update from you in the next year or so. That's going to sort of put a lot of flesh on the bones, and really looking forward to it. So thanks everybody. I hope to see you and others at the next webinar in a fortnight's time. And with that, say good night to everybody.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks. See ya.